And this will be a very difficult talk, and I don't even know if I'm up to it. We're telling the story from the greater Buddhism of Ormazd and Ahriman. And we'll go through this story as much as we told last time and then continue on from there. In the beginning, there were two spirits, Ormazd and Ahriman. The two are separated by the void. Ormazd is all good and light and unlimited in time. That means he's eternal. But he is limited in space by the void and by Ahriman, who lies on the other side of the void. Only by defeating Ahriman can Ormazd free himself from his limitation in space and become infinite as well as eternal. But, being good, he initiates no struggle with Ahriman. Ahriman is dark and evil. He is also limited in space by the void, and he is limited in time by the unconscious certainty of his eventual ruin at the hands of Ahriman, of Ormazd. Ahriman is limitation, or the spirit or embodiment of limitation. Ahriman is not, he once was not, and again will not be. Ahriman is so dark and so negative and so unknown that he cannot be spoken of directly. Ahriman does not remain indistinct or passive and elusive. He becomes distinct and destructive. He becomes the destroyer, the accursed, destructive spirit who is all wickedness and full of death, a liar and a deceiver. That's as far as we got last time. My goodness, all those notes on so few words. It's really getting crazy. I have sub-notes, and I'm just about ready to start sub-notes. Talk about it convoluted with epicycles. All right, so we'll begin the story from there. Ahriman and Ormazd participate in the dualistic principle of freedom and necessity. So what we're going to talk about all night is freedom and necessity. Both of them choose what they will become, and both are ontologically bound eternally by their own natures. I'll go through that again because it's an important and difficult thing. Both freely choose what they will become, that is, what they will do, and both are ontologically bound eternally by their own natures. So what it is saying, the Buddhism is saying basically the same thing that the Bible says, by their fruits ye shall know them. Now we have to remember that on the level that we're speaking of, which is we are elementary, most of the time we have no conception and no capability of freedom. But when we're speaking of prime creators, the latitude and the magnitude of free choice is so great that we can't comprehend it. If we think about it, the creative beings are free to choose to create the opportunities to choose from. You know what I'm saying? We at the most are lucky if we can see to choose between several opportunities. And once in a great while, we can be free to create. But to create even the opportunities, that's really quite something. And that's the kind of consciousness that is at the level of Ahriman and Ormazd. It's also important to remember that the character of Ormazd and Ahriman, when it says they are ontologically bound, meaning that they act out of their nature, that their character, their ontological binding, is not the way that we are bound by our negative attitudes or our habits or things like that. For spirits that are that much awake in the spiritual light, they have distilled and redistilled experience so that the essence of experience is so rare in their spiritual being that it's not at all like us, where we have a lingering outlook or a flavor of consciousness. Probably the best image or the best metaphor to understand their being ontologically bound is starlight. If you look very carefully and if you look with great magnification, all of the stars have colors. And all of the colors of the spectrum are found in stars. There are purple stars and red stars and green and yellow and orange. There are all colors of stars. But when we look at a star, what we see is light. And the amount of coloration is so small that it's almost negligible. And that's sort of like what the consciousness or the ontological consciousness of Ahriman and Ormazd is. All right, back in the story. Ormazd is free and freed from all taint of evil. There's no evil anywhere. Very much like in the Bible, God is light, and in God is no darkness anywhere. Ormazd is not evil at all. He has nothing of it in him. This is one of the beautiful things about dualism. If you have all of the evil located in one being, then the other being can be completely free from it, can be completely good. It's a thing that is, in the human sphere, becomes a very indulgent thing. Like our side and our friends or our clique or our faction is all good, and those reprobates are all bad. We've been cleansed of it. We've purified ourselves of it. Ormazd does not create evil, but neither did Jehovah, for that matter. But Jehovah did leave the option there for it. And then things start getting a little bit different. Ormazd does not willingly tolerate evil. Indeed, Ormazd wars against evil incessantly. This requires a little bit of analysis. Ormazd wars against evil incessantly. Obviously, that statement, the final one, doesn't seem consonant with the subtlety and purity and freedom of all the other statements. This might be because we're looking from the bottom up, and we're looking very much from a world of material illusion, and from a spiritual perspective of Ormazd, it might be something altogether of a different nature. Ormazd might be subsisting in transcendence and focusing in his own being, and from that projecting reflections into the phenomenal in the creative process. And that projection of light into the realms, through emanations, into the realms of matter, might appear to us, looking from the bottom up, as though there were attacking of the materialistic and dark and heavy Ahriman. However, even that requires some analysis, and it gets into some very, very difficult things, but things that are exceedingly rewarding if we can begin to understand them. In the first part of these talks, when we were talking about Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, we spoke a lot about the perspective box, where one way it looks like a pyramid and the other way it looks like a chute. Lately we have been looking at another very simple but very challenging mathematical analogy, and we've been calling that the dot game. We're saying that if we have a pure space with nothing differentiated in it, and we put down a dot, and then we put down another dot, and then we put down another dot, and we keep on putting down dots, and the object of putting down dots is to begin to understand disorganization. That is, to understand holy chaos, the source where everything comes from. The object is to never make a repeat pattern. And if we keep adding dot after dot after dot, with each addition, the nature of disorganization or the nature of chaos becomes more clear to us, because it gets harder to put down dots without creating a pattern. It's very interesting the way it goes, because in your eyes or in your consciousness, you have to see the pattern before you put the dot down. Because once you put the dot down, it's too late. You've already made a pattern. So the pattern exists in consciousness. What we learn when we play the dot game is something that mathematicians state, that there are an infinite number of patterns, but there is only one disorganization, only one chaos. Meaning to say that we can see with each dot, we can't put it here, or we can't put it there, or we can't put it there, because each would produce a different kind of pattern. Now, in effect, this is what Ormazd is doing. Ormazd is looking into creative chaos, because this Ormazd, like the life spirit, or like Christ, represents the living light of intelligibility. It represents light that is truth. As Pythagoras said it, if one is to describe God, the body of God would be light and the soul would be truth. And this life that lives on lives by this very process. Because once you start putting the dots down, you have to continue putting the dots down. Because at any time that you stop, you have made a pattern. Death sets in, and you have a pattern, and somebody could come along and replicate everything that you did. But as long as you keep putting down dots, you approach a description in negation through patterns of what that one eternal living chaos, that eternal living disorganization that can never be seen but can be approximated through the myriad patterns. That is what keeps the spirit alive, so to speak. So all of this is going to sound really funny now, but all of what we live in, the laws of nature, the thoughts, the music, and even the world around us, is a condensation of patterns. A condensation of patterns that are something like those that were foreseen by Ormazd in the examination of the chaos. And in effect, to keep Ormazd alive, or to keep it living, that life which renews itself by this very process, it throws off offal, O-F-F-A-L. And everything in existence, which is truly a divine creation, is also at the same time offal. It is the leavings of Ormazd, and it is what has to be perpetually thrown off in order for it to keep alive, for that spirit to keep alive. So, it's an unusual thing that once Ormazd is alive, Ormazd is free. And Ormazd is, like all free and alive and unique and creative beings, Ormazd is eternal. Ormazd has that character that is all his own. Free people are always unique. Creative people who can exercise their freedom are always unique. But the funny thing is, Ormazd is hooked. So freedom and necessity at this level are so closely bound together that one is free and determined at the same time. So we're into those dualities again. So it appears that Ormazd pursues divine disorganization, or pursues holy chaos as a way of living. That's one way of looking at it. But from the other perspective, Ormazd is living a life that is very purposeful, that is very creative, very imaginative, by creating, by projecting imaginations of what it could be into the unknown. That is by condensing things into matter. Now there's a paradox in all of this, too. There's all kinds of paradoxes. The paradox in this is that the holy chaos, the disorganization that goes beyond spiritual being, seems to be known. But the creative patterns that come off of it, to us, they may be very alive, but to Ormazd, they're dead. And they're unknown in some ways, or they have a quality, this isn't life. I mean, relative, if you're trying to know the universal spirit, or you're trying to know that holy chaos in that way, you can always say, this is not it. However, when we come to the other end, where it gets projected into space, the things that are projected into space are the projection of imaginations into the unknown, which congeal or crystallize the unknown. The funny thing is there that we think we know objects. We say seeing is believing, because we think we know objects but we don't know the unknown. So at each end of the paradox, one where one is peering into the disorganization, there is a knowing and an unknowing, and that is completely inverted at the other end of the pole of being in the projection into matter. So there's a lot of paradox. So dualism is kind of fun that way. So we'll go back to the story. One of Ormazd's first acts is to limit time, to remove it from or within the eternal. He knows that only in time can he struggle with Ahriman and destroy him. Now, I don't know whether the Mazdaists who put together the story or were inspired to tell it, whether they knew of all of the internal contradictions in it. I assume that since they were very intuitively insightful people, that they were probably keenly and deeply appreciative of it. So let's look at some of those contradictions, because there really are contradictions. The contradiction is that Ahriman, not Ormazd, is the limiter and is the destroyer. But here we have the story saying one of the first acts of Ormazd is to limit time, to remove it from the eternal. For he knows that only in time can he struggle with Ahriman and defeat him. So suddenly, Ormazd has gone from being a completely harmless being to taking on the character of Ahriman, both by limiting and by destroying. One of the first thoughts we get is maybe the awful in divine imaginations really is awful and decadent. And this would mean then that Ormazd is the source of evil. Doesn't seem too likely, especially with all the protestations in the other way. There is an old maxim that played a very important part in the life of Rudolf Steiner. Early in his career, he was basically a philosopher studying the philosophy of Goethe. But more and more, his spiritual investigations led him to believe that he had to do something for the people of our time. And that meant dealing with materialism. And he was presented with an old maxim that I think is what is involved with Ormazd. And that maxim is, to slay a dragon, you must get under its scales. And so this is what Ormazd is doing. He is getting under the scales of Ahriman. This might just be another way of stating in more abstract form the principle of freedom and necessity, of unlimitation and limitation. Both are subsumed in consciousness, whether it is waking consciousness or unconsciousness, as we talked about last time. Both are subsumed in that which is and yet is not was. Sort of the untouched state of existence, non-existence, but is untouched by dualism. So what Ormazd does is Ormazd creates a time that lasts 12,000 years. Well, it doesn't necessarily say that they're years. Let's just say that they're units or cycles. Most scholars agree that because of the influence of the Magians, that this is probably an astrological number. It's probably that, and it's probably something much more than that. In both Persia and Mesopotamia, there was a fascination, almost a distraction, with the number 12. Everything was dodecal. And astrology was seen as a division in time by 12. And the Babylonians, for example, knew about the dodecahedron, the 12-sided, the 12 faces of unity, going back to the principle in close packed structures, that the most dots that you can get around one dot in three-dimensional space are 12 around the 13th. And so they had everything was always divided up. Arcs of time and the angles of space that they subtended were divided into what was called sesquigesal time-space. Because sesquigesal is on a flat circle, the most that you can get is 6 around the 7th. And so something like that is going on. In the beginning, Ormazd knows of the existence of Ahriman. But Ahriman, in his dark ignorance, on the other side of the void, knows Ormazd not. So here we have a non-symmetric polarity. We're now dealing with vertical polarities, and all vertical polarities are asymmetric. That is, Ormazd knows of the existence of Ahriman, but Ahriman, in his dark ignorance, because he's way on the other side of the void, knows Ormazd not. This is really a sinister kind of thing, because Ahriman is not only darkness and ignorance and non-being and limitation. That ignorance is so great that it doesn't know its own ignorance. Maybe that's why it is as perfectly ignorant and as perfectly negative as it is. So we have more paradox. And more paradox means more words, obviously. We have from the first chapter of St. John's Gospel, and the light shined in darkness, and the darkness knew it not. Very much the same principle. It's like saying that darkness and emptiness are so subtly negative and so passive that the light can be right within them, or right within it, or can be right within not it, would probably be the better way of saying it, and not affect it at all. It's sort of a paradoxical reflection of the Taoist statement, which speaks of the life spirit, or speaks of the consciousness of Ormazd, that says it does everything while giving the appearance of doing nothing. So we have a paradox of reflective dualism in subtlety and in passivism. Ahriman is safe in his not knowing, and his strength and his invulnerability is in his sleep and in his ignorance. In all of this, one might even say that Ahriman serves Ormazd with his passive negation. because it is this passive negation and limitation that makes for that unknown that draws the light on. But we got to remember that right now we're deeply immersed in material darkness. We right now live in the realms of Ahriman, in the very much manifest, and we're very far removed from the Ormazdic light. Right now, in our quest for light, we apply science. But the funny thing is that our science right now is highly Ahrimanic. In short, the negation is serving the quest for light in a very, very positive way. Most scientific experiments almost never make positive statements. They can definitively say that it is not this, or reality is not that. Very rare that any scientist would think of positing anything. Oh yes, in speculation, in theorization, they postulate the possibility of this or the possibility of that, and they say if this were so, this would be the thing. But any experiment by science is done by negation. It's a statement saying that, well, we know this isn't so. And so what it does is it approximates or defines the reality of truth by saying what it isn't. It's a very negative way of going about things. Now, this is very reminiscent of what we just looked at a moment ago. This is saying that even Ahrimanic space or Ahrimanic science in our realms of space and matter is very much like Ormazd peering into the unmanifest, into the complete chaos, into the complete disorganization, and throwing off potential or throwing off imaginings that are awful, that are not the reality of that all being in disorganization. Only here, the form of knowledge and the provable form of knowledge is by finding the light that is the light of truth, by knowing what isn't the case. So we're at a double level of disorganization here, and all of our quest for knowledge, even though it is Ahrimanic, still serves the light. It's a very, very interesting thing that goes on. So from our point of view, Ormazd is defined or derived in a light darkness, you might say. Ahriman is serving Ormazd, and Ormazd is known because even the most negative scientist still has a great respect for the truth, has a wonderful respect for logic and how this follows from, or how this can or cannot be. Very high integrity in all of that. So it's perfectly all right for us to participate in Ahrimanic science, provided we realize that it's only a perspective, and that it is only the perspective of negation and of limitation, and provided we always remember ourselves so as to not get lost in the view of negation. There's another aspect of science, as we know science now, that is very Ahrimanic. That is, it is attuned to destruction and to decay. If we look at the basic nature of all energy, according to the second law of thermodynamics, all energy goes from a higher energy state to a lower energy state. All work is accomplished by energy going into decay. All of our nuclear energy is basically the energy of decay. Funny thing, it's going back to disorganization. It's going back to chaos in a principle that is called entropy. Our biology and the medicine that we derive from it is based on killing. We can only see how life forms work by basically killing them. And even when we try to deal with things like diseases, we try to kill them. So all of what we call progress, or all of what we call enlightenment, is to a large extent Ahrimanic. It's very deathly, it's very limiting, and it is in some ways very darkening. These are all statements about the awful, but not from a Ormazdic point of view. This is the chaos that we're looking at here is a terminal chaos, but equally unknowable. So even though Ahrimanic science and some of the technology that derives from it gives only negatives and materialistic approximation of Ormazdic reality, and a decadent view at that, it still serves the light by reflecting it in its forms, by in its not thisness is the way it works. This is just one more case of Ahriman serving Ormazd without intending to do so. In fact, intending to do just the opposite. So it's all right to participate in this as long as we remember what we're doing. And even Ahrimanic things are benign. And if we look at it in the ultimate, even the curiosity of the most negative, the not-isness of Ahriman has some engagement about it. It is, since Ormazd feels that Ormazd must overcome it by limiting time and dealing with Ahriman in time by condensing or solidifying the negation of Ahriman. Even in that pre-condensed state, the not-isness of Ahriman is engaging, and it is like Faust's eternal feminine. In Goethe's Faust, he ends saying that the eternal feminine always leads us onward. And so then the non-being quality of Ahriman leads the light to go forward. All right, back into the story. In the course of the first 3,000 years, that is the first quarter of the cycle, Ahriman discerns across the void a point of light. So when time has been a cycle of time that has 12,000 subcycles, when in the first quarter of that, Ahriman peers across the void and he sees one point of light. This is something interesting now. Sensing that light, Ahriman covets it. He longs for it, and literally he lusts for it and determines to possess it. Still more paradox. It's almost as though the Mazdaists are putting us on, like they're playing a gigantic joke on us. putting us on by giving us very simplistic light for truth of Ormazd, and then giving us all sorts of paradoxes and inversions within all of that. If you think about it now, this is look at it from Ahriman's point of view with regard to our own lives. What could possibly be wrong with seeking the light? No. He wants it. What could possibly be wrong with wanting the light? And the light that he wants is not some false reflected light, not some sheen of egoism or something like that. He wants the light of Ormazd. When you think about it, that's what our lives are all about. Light, more light. I would think that it would be a wonderful thing that even the spirit of darkness and the spirit of negation should seek the light. Isn't that the truth? And I would say yes, and I would say an unqualified yes, that Ahriman's seeking for the light is a good and positive thing. I happen to be in good company because some thinkers, like Rudolf Steiner, foresees that everything that we call darkness and negation, all of that will be redeemed. There's an ultimate redemption of Lucifer that we spoke of last year as the false light and that which eggs us on to unnecessary action or self-indulgent action. And this year, Ahriman, our current subject, the spirit of negation, both will be redeemed. So the story is obviously told in some kind of simplistic partisan form. However, Ahriman wants to do more than just long for the light and to live by it. He lusts for it, which is sort of a Luciferic quality, and he wants to possess it, and he wants to hold it, which is really to destroy it, but that's not his intention. It's like saying that, bound by his own spirit, if we try to take the light and try to hold it, that's the very thing that can't be done with it. And because his nature is as negative as it is, it does want to hold it, not to destroy it, but to have it for itself. It's almost like some of the fairy tales where an ugly beast wants something that is pretty and beautiful, like a child or something like that, something very precious, because it realizes the voidness of anything lively and light in its own life, and it wants to possess it for its own, not knowing that that very act has the tendency to destroy it. It's again ironic how light can be extinguished or put to sleep by a darkness, and a darkness which doesn't even know itself. That's a really interesting thing. All right. So far, we have been looking at the philosophical nature of this story. And doing that in the flat sphere or the pure sphere of philosophy, it has been difficult to get anywhere beyond the painful paradoxes of dualism. And some of them are very difficult beyond my capacity to understand them, at least at present. And this has all been very nice, but it's becoming really clear now from the nature of the story that it's more and more obvious that we have to take something of a cosmological interpretation of the story. It's the only way we're going to be able to appreciate it for what it is, and it's the only way we're going to avoid flat and vague, simplistic allegories. So let's begin looking at that way. The story does begin flat and vague, with that kind of a very vague negative definition of Ahriman, and almost nothing is said about Ormazd, but that he's all good. In fact, he's unspeakably good. So Ahriman is unknowably negative, and Ormazd is unspeakably good. And it's a being that lives without limitation in the eternal. After that, the more things become definite. Everything we've looked at tonight has had paradoxes in it. As soon as the story gets a little deeper, gets a little bit more worked out, what happens is Ormazd becomes a limiter with the intention of destroying. While on the other hand, Ahriman becomes a seeker of the light. And now that's really very, very paradoxical. It says Ormazd is good and initiates no struggle with Ahriman. But then it turns around and says Ormazd knows of the existence of Ahriman across the void and that he must struggle with and destroy him. There are some things in here that are unfathomably difficult for me. But let's go back to Ahriman one more. Ahriman seems to be more the object of attention, even to Ormazd. The greater Bundehism says Ahriman is not, once was not, and again will not be. That makes him the ultimate boogie spirit. The being and character and personification of the spirit of negation is a very engaging topic. And I want to look at it from several points of view. Let's look at it from probably one of the better psychological points of view, the Jungians. The Jungians have, for their Ahrimanic figure, they have what they call the shadow. And the shadow is a personification of all of our character that we have made detestable and have not owned up to, but have repressed, or that we have ignored and not developed, and in our anxious avoidance have made to seem fearsome and have repressed it. I'll go over that again because that's a really good definition. The shadow is the personification of all of our character that we have made detestable and have not owned up to, but have repressed, or all of our character that we have ignored and not developed, and in our anxious avoidance have made to seem fearsome and have repressed it. On the other hand, the spirit of negation or of darkness as manifest, it's a little bit more definite. For the mystery schools, it's the dweller of the threshold. The dweller is an entity that is composed of all of the unredeemed thoughts, feelings, desires, actions, and experience from all of our past lives since the fall. Something much more definite. The dweller is an entity that is composed of all of the unredeemed thoughts, feelings and desires, actions, and experiences from all of our past lives since the fall. Both the conception of the shadow and the reality of the dweller are important to character development. Both show in a very important way that we are responsible for all of our being. We are responsible for everything we have done and everything we have not done. The concept of the shadow, as it is stated, is very important in showing us the consequences of what we have not done and that we have repressed and that we've become anxious about. It's sort of like the undone things in ourselves. The dweller is important in that it shows a very persistent responsibility for every thought, every deed, every avoidance, and their collective form. That is to say, it is composed of, and its shape, so to speak, is comprised of trends and tendencies of thinking, or trends and tendencies that may have persisted over a long time, many millennia, of desiring one way or another. It is a living history of what we have done or what we have ignored. Now, both of these are really important things. We can see that there are parts of ourselves that even in this life, if we're honest, and when we do come to consciousness of them, we can see that there are things that we have repressed. And that we do have a shadowy existence of ourself that we would never believe was ourself. So effective have we repressed them by thinking we're such angels. And we carry with us a huge burden of unredeemed negativity. It seems like we're constantly aware, if we're trying to grow, of all the nastiness that is potential in us. There isn't a day that goes by that we don't think a bundle of thoughts that are not positive at all, and we're egging ourselves on. So both of these conceptions about negation, as we can experience it in our own being, are very valuable, are very rewarding for spiritual growth. But neither of these conceptions describe Ormazd and his relation to Ahriman. Neither of them do that. Ormazd has no evil or no darkness anywhere, nothing repressed. He is all light and conscious being. There's nothing hidden. There is nothing that has not been dissolved. In fact, everything has been dissolved so that it is like starlight. There may be a few little tints in the light of color, but the light so burns so brightly that the color is almost nothing. So Ormazd has no anxious avoidance from anything in the past. So the question is then for us, what does Ahriman represent in this cosmological sense? I'll give you a few views about it, all of them very nascent and certainly not satisfactory. As far as I can see, is when Ormazd peers into his being and renews his life by looking toward the wholly unmanifest disorganization that is a kind of life with a capital L, and does this eternally, there is a sensing of the infinite life of chaos. In this process, there is throwing off more and more of creative imaginings, and as a consequence, there is more and more light I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this. And in short, it's a very non-egoistic way of knowing the light. You don't really know yourself, but you sense in an unspeakable way the awe of being. It is a not-isness, and it is, as we were talking about in the poetry last time, some things are so holy that you can't say them directly. You can say it's not this, and it's not that, and it's not that. With the awareness of that light, and the awareness of that light in seeing everything that emanates from it, as glorious as it may be, is nothing compared to that unmanifest, invisible light of chaos or disorganization. The realization of that light is that there is a good deal that is not known. And that which is still not known, but potentially there, lurking in that same disorganization, is Ahriman. So we could say it again, and the light shined in darkness, and darkness knew it not, and the light knew it not. It knew itself, it knew its potential, but not the darkness itself. So again, the darkness, or the potential darkness, is an eternal feminine that's leading us on. To the nature of light, the unknown potential does represent the opportunity for more light. That's part of the perpetual becoming. But in the eyes of the world, where we are now, that potential to more light is not seen necessarily as an opportunity. It's seen as an adversary that has to be overcome. So even though this story is told and retold eternally, there's no history, because the darkness has never been known. It's only been sensed across the void. If we look at it in this way, but we have to be careful now, because we are in the world of a personification of darkness, of a personification of Ahriman. If we view it in this way, Ahriman then represents an ultimate fertility to new life and to new light. So it's something that both the shadow and the dweller have that same quality of fertility. Ela Waterman has a wonderful tape by an English poet named David White. He has given 2 lectures that are on tape, and they are spectacular. I have never heard anyone speak as well in my life as David White. One is called Images of Fire, and one is called Images of Water. And in one of these lectures, David White begins to become uneasy about something in himself. And the more he goes into himself, and because his creativity is not what he wants it to be. And as he goes into himself and goes down into the levels, to the layers of incandescence, it is sort of like putrid, and it's so long gone in the soul that it is forgotten. But in that is where he finds the greatest fertility for his creation. It means a struggle with something very dark and something very negative, something that has to not only be awakened, but overcome in spirit, that it leads to a creativity like never before. So this is but the Ahrimanic negativity has no history to it, but because of its subtlety and because of its no history to it, it has a possibility of even greater creativity. Because there is no preconditioning, no history, it is ultimately virgin. Okay, so that's a really, this is a view of Ormazd and Ahriman that is very close to primal cosmogony, where we're always at an edge, where something is perpetually being born in us, or something is always perpetually dying in us. Paul says, I die daily, and because of that, I come back to life daily. So, when the spirit wakes up, it comes to light, and it knows what it is, and it also knows what it is not, and that it knows that there is potential for more being. And in that potential, there is what is not, and that is what we must become through. And that's why the struggle, it looks like a struggle between Ormazd with overcoming Ahriman. So Ormazd is not just an attacker, and Ahriman in disguise. Because Ormazd is giving and enlightening and creating, its purpose is always to find light, more light. The story was told by a fierce and lusty people, and so it's seen as a battle. The likely reality of it is probably very much like David White's experience, that by loving the darkness, by loving the unknown, and knowing that it's completely unknown, by giving yourself in love to that, there's no limit to the potential of the creativity that can come out when there is no hint of any kind of conditioning of any kind. It's a very important thing. So this gives us a better view of how the two become like each other, but it also wakes us up to a new principle of dualism that we haven't discussed yet, and so for the rest of the night we're going to talk about a new principle of dualism. We'll try to relate it back to the old ones so that we have a better understanding. It also brings us back to the story again, where Ormazd becomes the limiter and Ahriman becomes the light seeker. This principle that we're going to talk about now for a while can be stated in a simple way, but knowing me, it's not going to stay simple. Stated in a simple way, it's stated in physics, opposites attract. Electrons and protons, or electrons and positrons, are attractive to each other. Opposites attract. We're going to go back into psychology again because it's very beautiful. It fits right into spiritual philosophy. Carl Jung did a lot of reading on everything from Indian studies to Gnosticism to alchemy, and he did quite a bit of study of the Greeks. And he borrows a principle from a mysteries philosopher named Heraclitus from Pontius. He calls this principle enantiodromia. You can tell all of your friends that you heard a talk about enantiodromia last night, and you'll really impress them. He elaborates and extends Heraclitus' principle, which is our opposites are good for us, and we yearn for them, and we lean toward them. Heraclitus states, life begets death, and death begets new life. That in some cyclical, ongoing way, the opposites produce each other, and this is what there is with the ongoing. It's a simplified way of trying to deal with that very edge between manifest being and unknown that we've come back to several times now, but it's that same idea only in a more down-to-earth way. Life begets death, and death begets life. Jung relates it in a different way. He relates it to a stream from the unconscious into our future development of conscious character. So this for Jung is whatever we are now and whatever we are doing now, there is a stream that comes from the unconscious part of our being that leads us to do something opposite and something different. It's a beautiful way of stating it, however, since it's stated within matter by someone who is primarily a materialist, it is related to linear time and that kind of evolution. Nonetheless, he had some beautiful insights into it. He goes into brief analyses and shows how it is related to the conversion of St. Paul and the conversion of Raymond Lully and the conversion of Swedenborg and the conversion and reconversion of Nietzsche, and how people become opposite of what they were. He teams this concept of enantiodromia with another concept which he calls compensation. And compensation is an internal tendency in the whole being to maintain a healthy balance by consciously or unconsciously directing the attention and the activity to the opposite every time there is an extreme assertion. So it means every time we set off to do something in order to maintain a healthy balance, remember we talked about balanced extremism as being a very healthy spiritual approach to life. Every time that we make an assertion of one type or another, there is something in us that in a healthy way seeks a counterbalance. Something you might say in a flat way like Newton's third principle of motion. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The combination of enantiodromia and compensation is something that we all experience many, many ways. One of the simplest ways is if we walk the rail. I've made it all the way across Monona Bay. I've learned the secret of walking the rail. But if you start to get off balance, what do? You do an extreme motion the other direction, and you vibrate back and forth until you get your balance back again. Well, that's a compensation. Even putting a weight over there is another way. Probably the most full-blown expression of compensation and enantiodromia that most of us experience is mating and marriage. It takes place in all of our lives, and it brings things out of us that we never would have known were there. It's almost like when we commit ourselves in one action that there is a opposite reaction. I want to look at it in a different way. I want to look at it in terms of cosmogony and self-awakening through spiritual exercises, which is what we've been trying to do all along. So we now have to tie it together with everything we've done before. When we looked at Angra Mainyu and Ahura Mazda, we noted what we called a primitive, materialistic, object-oriented, exclusive, horizontal dualism. That is, Ahura Mazda created good things and Angra Mainyu destroyed them. But each were acting according to their opposite natures. The opposites were drawn to each other by centering their attention on an object. And relating to that object according to their nature. This way of being drawn together as opposites is not what you would call compensation. It is primitive, and because it is so action-oriented, and so action-oriented in a very limited material world, it has a destructive quality about it. There's no enantiodromia in it, except maybe it's a very far-fetched way. A little later, when we came as far as we were going to go for now with horizontal dualism, we looked at balanced extremism as probably the healthiest way of dealing with polarities or dualism for soul growth. Strangely enough, the balanced extremism does have something of an enantiodromia within it, but in a very different way than the way that Jung looks at it. I'll quote literally what Jung says. Jung conceives of compensation to be a force, literally, now this is a quotation, an inherent self-regulation of the psychic apparatus. So there is an inherent self-regulation of the psychic apparatus, as though we have no part in it. Well, as with many things, Jung doesn't mention what that force is or what that apparatus is other than that it is. However, when we look at horizontal dualism, we didn't do that either. With balanced extremism, we ignored that completely. But that's the beauty of hindsight. I'm very glad I have a Mercury that rises way after the sun. I can look back and correct all of my errors. Actually, what sustains balanced extremism and what sustains compensation and enantiodromia can be stated in one or two simple words very simply. Unity. Spiritual unity. Spirit is, or consciousness and the joy of becoming conscious is an ongoing thing. We looked at that last time. But in this sense, being or becoming, but especially the word being, is both passive, as in the intelligible subsistence of the Platonists. The spirit subsists, and it just is. But it is also active, as in the sense of Meister Eckhart. When Meister Eckhart says God is enjoying himself. The unity of consciousness, the spiritual unity that holds together, is what connects cause and consequence in the horizontal. And it is what holds together the truth or the relations between the emanations in the vertical, according to the principle of analogy, as above, so below. However, if we look at that, it is too much like blissed out Platonism, in that it is flat, it's tautological. It's like saying the Spirit is, and therefore the Spirit is. It's not something that relates to our daily life as much as compensation and enantiodromia. We're always bringing ourselves to a balance. This is in part because it seems so distant from our daily life, but not entirely so. It really wants action. The concept of compensation or enantiodromia, which could be called the librations of the soul, is a statement that is made from deep in matter and in linear time. The fact of the matter is one cannot attain or maintain balanced extremism or spiritual equipoise by linear external assertions. Every time we try to do something to change things, we produce another imbalance. It's like the statements go, extreme engenders extreme, or extreme begets extreme. And in some cases, they're even terrible, vengeful extremes. So we really do long for balance. We long for peace and for unity. But as long as we take initiative, the pendulum of cause and consequence becoming new cause, that's the way of the world. It's always going to be that way. In this longing, we are sometimes tempted to indifference. That is, cease doing new causes. Or, in modern terms, get off the merry-go-round. However, if we did that, there would be no progress. And even going from extreme to extreme, imbalance to imbalance is probably better than no progress at all. There would be no new light. And if there were no new light, we would never attain the ormazdic consciousness. So what we're seeking for in balanced extremism is something else. What gives meaning and life and capability of balanced extremism is the center. When we focus on the center of our being, when we focus on the heart of our existence, we radiate out from us in all directions, horizontal, vertical, and even in throughness, so that when our focus is in the center, in the heart of the matter, we are automatically acting. It is that by turning inward, everything radiates out from us. If we are truly in the center, it is very much like balance. At the center of the balance, at the black hole, the center of our existence, all creation comes from there. If we do that, all of our radiations are peaceful. They're live and they're balanced. They go out everywhere in the same degree. If we maintain our center, we can even put our attention outward into objects. Because those objects are actually within us. What I'm trying to say is, when we center, and if you look at it, it's really the reality of the fact, really the reality of the matter, or the fact of the matter, that when we center and pour our energy inward toward the center, we radiate out and we produce a womb. And in that womb of existence, objects exist. There is a whole soul life. And in all the life and the extent of that radius and everything that exists within that depends on the degree and the intensity of our concentration. And it is in that soul life that we find the compensation and antiodromia. But we can't live to just resurrect our being. We have to live in a conscious nowness. And when we do that, our lives live. So if our concentration, if our attention is centered and sufficient, we can even put our consciousness outward, and we can get involved in observations of things that are apparently outside in the stream of causes and consequences and never be taken off balance. We can be in linear time and we can be in spiritual time because they all exist within that unity. We never become eccentric if we keep that center of consciousness. What is even more important, if we focus on that center and associate that center with the center of all things inwardly, we can know the heart of being. We can know the intent and the purpose of all things. That is, we can know the mind of God. In either case, as long as we're centering, we're in touch and creating the force of an antiodromic life. We're going to have more to say about this later on. So right now, what we have is we have a little bit of insight into the contradictions and paradoxes and the inversions in the story of Ormazd and Ahriman. Ormazd and antiodromically takes on limitation that is normally the character of Ahriman in order to give to the darkness and in so doing overcome the darkness. Ahriman and antiodromically wakes up to and seeks the light, which is normally the character of Ormazd. So they're both drawn in an antiodromia toward each other as opposites, and with extremes that are portrayed as antagonistic. They're drawn to a common center, like Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, only without an object, and a center that is not a center of contention, but a center of peace and a center of concentration. So we have two antagonists coming toward a common center, and so we have a suspense of what's going to happen, and so we'll leave it there in true serial fashion for next time. And antiodromia.
What define it?
It is a constant seeking for opposite, to opposite of whatever our state is now, to maintain a fresh, healthy life in an ongoing continuum of time.
Okay. So, if opposites attract, what do they beget?
New light or new consciousness is what they would say. The universe, from the spiritual point of view, opposites attracting each other would be continuously being given birth to Christ, to a new light that comes out or a new consciousness that comes out of it.
The reason I ask the question is that universal law states that light begets light. Why would opposites attract? Unless they are one and the same within.
Well, you're going to where we're eventually going in direction, but we want to get there with a little bit more full consciousness. I have no disagreement with what you're saying. We've in effect said that several times in the past already too, that dualism can't even be understood completely with dualism. Because the only time that dualism could be understood would be in the impact when Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu were met at the object, and they were fighting over the object, one perpetually creating, one perpetually destroying. and they would never know each other. There is no knowledge unless there is something common, or if there's something that both partake of. And that we're going to come back to that a number of times yet. Without preaching, the moral of tonight's talk is we should continuously be seeking out something that we aren't. And that there is, if we are in the center of our being, we are naturally led in the soul life that is everything that is within the aura, so to speak, of our consciousness. That soul life takes us just where we need to go, provided we're on the center. It's sort of like saying something that we talk about in the astrology classes, that if you try to stand still on a bicycle and not tip over, it's almost impossible to do. But if you're going forward, it's easier to balance. However, you can't go forward without being balanced, because if you get off balance, you lose all forward momentum. Only what we're saying now is that the relationship between projection and balance in a compensatory libra manner is found in a centering through which both the initiatory action or the emanatory action and the compensatory reaction flow across that common center. If they come from that center, this is healthy living. That you can engage in any activity that you want to, provided you never lose the center, because if you never lose your center, you will automatically have the balanced whole that radiates from that center, and in your trip through any kind of assertion, you will be drawn in antidromically to what you need, rather than having it just happen in an unconscious way as the Freudians would have it happen. The Jungians would have it happen. The Jungians are pretty strong on not ever being able to know the unconscious, which is in some ways like not ever being able to know Ahriman, because it is not. You can't know what is not, and light can shine in the darkness, but it doesn't see the darkness. All it sees is light, or whatever it has projected within the light. But there's too much of an element of, I don't want to say how you say, automatic or accidental behavior. What we're saying that the spiritual life is a more deliberate life. And in that deliberation, there is the same kind of regulatory balance, but it isn't automatic. It is second nature to the very act itself, because it's very hard to maintain that kind of centering.
So because you're saying, and it makes sense, I mean, the part that has made sense all along is the point of centering, then one can see that the spirit is the extremes opposed against itself, which is why one can say that one would expect Lucifer's redemption as well as
Ahriman's.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Unless there's more questions, this is our shaded member, who's making her own private little Ahrimanic world. Had anything? I mean, they're rose-colored glasses, deeply rose.